Welcome everyone. I see that there are people from many different places, I guess, at least in the names that I recognize there among the audience. Welcome to the last of the webinars in this first cycle organized by the Spanish Association for Interdisciplinary India Studies with the sponsorship of the Embassy of India in Spain and funding from other sources as well. My name is Belén Martín Lucas, and I'm professor in English at the University of Vigo in Galicia, in Spain, specialized in feminist and post-colonial studies, and I will be chairing this evening's session. It is a real pleasure to celebrate this International Women's Day with this transnational conversation between these two wonderful women and most inspiring feminists, Chandra T, Mohanty and Antonia Navarro-Tejero, who will be debating for about 1 hour or a little bit more than an hour on rape culture and global futures. We will leave 30 minutes approx at the end for questions from the audience. And so if you could place your questions in the chat box, I will be collecting them and then I will bring them to the speakers at the end of their conversation. The session is being recorded and it will be uploaded at the association's website. And you can already find there the previous talks, the previous sessions of this webinar on dystopic literature and on education, in case any of you are interested in watching them. I will ask all of you to mute your microphones and cameras, okay? So that we have just the speakers on the screen. And later, you know, we will have time for those questions if you send them through the chat box. I will now introduce our speakers. Chandra T. Mohanty is a distinguished professor of women's and gender studies and Dean's Professor of the Humanities at Syracuse University in the US. Her work focuses on transnational feminist theory and anti-capitalist feminist praxis, anti-racist education, and the politics of knowledge. She's the author of fundamental books like Feminism Without Borders, Decolonizing Theory, Practicing Solidarity. She is also co-editor of Third World Women and the Politics of Feminism, Feminist Genealogies, Colonial Legacies, Democratic Futures, Feminism and War, Confronting US Imperialism, The Sage Handbook on Identities, and Feminist Freedom Warriors. She's also the author of one of the most influential essays of feminism Under Western Eyes and its revised version, Under Western Eyes Revisited, that all students of feminist theory and post-colonial theory read around the globe. Her writing has been translated to over 20 languages, and she is also the series editor of Comparative Feminist Studies for Palgrave Springer and co-creator with Linda Carty of the Feminist Freedom Warriors Digital Video Archive that you can find on their website, feministfreedomwarriors.org. She's a member of the advisory boards of numerous journals, including, among others, Science, a journal of women and culture and society, of women in culture and society, Feminist Africa, Asian Women, Feminist Economics, or the Caribbean Review of Gender Studies, Gender and Politics. She also serves on several international advisory boards. For instance, she was just mentioning before her collaboration with GEMA, the European MA in Women and Gender Studies, that is led by the University of Granada in Spain, but also for the Center for Multidisciplinary Studies on Racism at Uppsala University, the Center for Intersectional Justice in Berlin, the Project on Armed Conflict Resolution and People's Rights in India, on the Academic Advisory Council Jewish Voice for Peace, and the Advisory Circle Jews Against Anti-Muslim Racism. She has taught at universities all over the world, in Europe, Asia, Africa, Latin America. She is a steering committee member of the Municipal Services Project, a transnational research and advocacy group focused on alternatives to privatization in the Global South. And she's a founding member of the Democratizing Knowledge Collective. Also a principal investigator of the D.K. Summer Institute Just Academic Spaces, creating new publics through radical literacies at Syracuse University, and coordinating team member of the Future of Minority Studies Research Project at Cornell. She is quite busy, as you can all see. She was a member of the Indigenous and Feminist of Color Solidarity delegation to Palestine in 2011, and has served as a consultant for the Association of American Colleges and Universities, the Ford Foundation, and United Nations Women. Today, she will be speaking with the president of our association, Antonia Navarro-Tejero, who teaches cultural studies and South Asian literature in English at the University of Córdoba, where she chairs the permanent seminar on India studies. She has lived and lectured in the US, in India, and in Spain, of course. And she has been Fulbright Scholar at the University of California, Berkeley, with Professor Bharati Mukherjee. And she's currently senior researcher at Syracuse University with Salvador de Madariaga program, within that program, with Chandra Mohanty. She has been visiting professor in the Netherlands, in Sri Lanka, Ireland, Poland, Portugal, India, and Bangladesh. Her research interests include post-colonial theory and criticism, transnational gender studies, body politics, and biomedical discourse. She's the author of the books Globalizing Dissent, Essays on Arundhati Roy, Gender and Caste in the Anglophone Indian Novels of Arundhati Roy and Gita Hariharan, Feminist Issues in Cross-Cultural Perspectives, and Talks on Feminism, Indian Women Activists Speak for Themselves, among many other publications, including articles, book chapters, etc. She's also the editor of the series India Studies for Cambridge Scholars Publishing. She's currently the leading researcher of the project Embodiments, Genders and Difference, Cultural Practices of Violence and Discrimination, and a member in the research project Bodies in Transit 2, funded by the Spanish Ministry of Science and Innovation, where both of us collaborate. She is, as I was saying, our elected president of the Spanish Association for Interdisciplinary India Studies, an academic body that she founded in 2007. And she is the motor of this association, undoubtedly. This is the association that is organizing today's event as the closing session in a first webinar cycle. So I'm giving now the mic and the space to Dr. Antonia Navarro, and she will be taking and leading the conversation, okay? Thank you very much, and I will just disconnect everything until the very end, okay?
Okay. Thank you so much, Melinda. Good evening, everyone, or good morning or afternoon, wherever you're connected from at this time around the globe. Thank you very much, Professor Martin, for your kind introduction you made of us and for having taken the time and effort to be here with us. I really appreciate that. It is my pleasure always to be surrounded by outstanding scholars like you and the many of them that we can find in the audience. So it's my privilege to have Professor Chandra Mohanty here to celebrate with the Spanish Association for Interdisciplinary India Studies International Women's Day. What a year it has been since the last time we marked this occasion, which actually prevented us from having you, Chandra, during our seminar last year face-to-face. But I'm honored by your acceptance to our invitation to have an online conversation, at least, on issues that really concern us all as teachers and activists. I have elaborated a few questions with food for thought, with the idea in mind that Professor Mohanty answers will be grounded in the theoretical and political issues that she has worked on during her career, such as transnational feminist theory, solidarity across borders, politics of knowledge, and higher education. We really hope to share with you the publication of this interview sometime soon. So Professor Mohanty.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Antonia and Belen, for inviting me and for hosting me for this conversation. I am really happy to be here, and I hope that, in fact, it'll be useful to all the people who have shown up this evening or afternoon or morning. It's actually noon my time. So what I might want to do, Antonia, if it's okay with you, is I want to just read a very short statement that will situate where I am in my head and the things I'm thinking about and the things that I think folks who are involved in any kind of radical critique and engagement, political engagement with the present moment, need to be thinking about. And so, of course, given that I have lived in the US for a number of decades, my location really is here in the US. So first of all, happy International Women's Day. So this day brings just a huge number of challenges for women around the world. It is a day that we celebrate in terms of the resistance that we've seen of women everywhere, including now in India in the farmers' struggles. There was a delegation in the Punjab of 40,000 women farmers that got on their tractors and went to Delhi to celebrate and demonstrate today for International Women's Day. It's just one of the many, many things that women are doing. And you, of course, must have heard about what happened in Mexico, where they closed off the Mexican Parliament House. So because they didn't want women to disrupt or throw things. And women essentially took over the walls and wrote the names of every single woman who has died through femicide all over. So that to me illustrates really what it means to talk about International Women's Day. You know, it's always something to celebrate because our place is in the revolution and the resistance, and it is a time to really take stock of the kinds of struggles that lie ahead of us. So now it is exactly 2 months, almost to the day actually, since the white supremacist takeover or attempted coup at the US Capitol. And it's a little bit less than 2 months since the swearing in of Joe Biden and Kamala Harris as the new president and vice president of the USA. Both were historic events for different and connected reasons, and both can only be understood in relation to the racialized, gendered, capitalist history of the US. Remember that January 6th, something else happened, another historic event, right, which is totally overshadowed by this one, and that is that on January 6th, it was a multiracial coalition of Black women, specifically led by Black women in Georgia, US, that took over the US Senate through electoral means. In other words, it was the organizing of Black women in Georgia that led to an electoral victory, which was completely significant in terms of what happened in the Senate, what is now a majority in the Senate, right? So they took over through electoral means, in contrast to Trump's heavily armed white Make America Great Again followers storming the US Capitol. To many of us, the white supremacist uprising instigated by then President Trump was not surprising. Many called it an attack on the house of democracy, right? The US Capitol is seen as the house of democracy. But the question that begs to be asked is, what does democracy mean if it does not address questions of racial, class, and gender justice? What does democracy mean if it is deeply tied to extractive racial capitalism and dispossession? After all, racist, sexist, and imperial democracies have always thrived alongside neoliberal capitalism. The last few decades have witnessed the global rise of populism, nationalism, and religious fundamentalism, buttressed by the normalization of ideologies of neoliberalism and white supremacy, in the case of India, Brahminical supremacy, as a central feature of politics. This normalization of legacies of misogynist racial capitalism and the neoliberal colonization of language and public life has led not only to the privatization of social justice commitments, but also to what education scholar Henry Giroux calls neoliberal fascism, that conjoins the worst excesses of capitalism with fascist ideals. And here's a quote from Giroux, quote, "The veneration of war, a hatred of reason and truth, a populist celebration of ultranationalism and racial purity, the suppression of freedom and dissent, a culture which promotes lies." By the way, there was a study done that said that there were 30,000 falsehoods that were documented during the Trump presidency, 30,000, okay? Spectacles, a demonization of the other, a discourse of decline, brutal violence, and state violence in heterogeneous forms. So these are all things that occur at the same time. To this list, I would add toxic masculinity and a politics of pollution and disposability as central features of neoliberal authoritarianism. Populism, nationalism, and religious fundamentalism conjoined with neoliberal governance practices often create a moral panic, calling for national revivals of unity based on traditional family values, muscular masculinity, compulsory heterosexuality, and parenting based on paternal authority and discipline. And so we had Trump's America First, Viktor Orban's Hungary First, Kaczynski's One Poland, and Modi's India Rising, and many more, as you know. And of course, we're in the midst of a global pandemic that has exposed all the colonial legacies and accompanying class, race, and gender inequities that liberal Western democracies are built on and try to hide. So, what does an anti-racist, decolonial, anti-capitalist feminist praxis consist of at this time, when colonial legacies and global inequities are no longer invisible, and building solidarities and movements across borders is more urgent than ever before? I think this is really the question before us, and it's the question for the future.
Great, we're at 5:20, and I think we should get underway.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction, Professor Mohanty. We'll continue with a little bit, will be just food for thought about different issues around your career. Let's start with the issue of representation, for example. So I'm curious to know if you're usually approached by mass media in general, like outside academia or NGOs or any other institution, and also by hegemonic self-proclaimed feminists in particular. As a spokesperson for South Asian women, because I'm taking into account that they may consider you as an insider to Indian culture, even though you have spent decades in the US so far. I'm going to say insider, I mean, without the plural, right? As a monolith, as you're following your own theory. This is not our intention, obviously, here in this webinar, as we don't expect you to be a scholar on South Asian studies, but your theoretical work and your experience with social movements will definitely add the most interesting perspective on rape culture, even though if you're not an expert on that, or the global future, obviously. So the idea that Indian men are repulsive, are depraved, and Indian women are vulnerable, subjugated, as shown by the Western media after selected rape cases, take us back to colonial times when the British alerted the countrymen against the lascivious natives. I'm thinking, right, for example. Yeah. So that sensationalism derived from the gruesome details of the media coverage. I'm thinking of the terrible Delhi 2012 gang rape that demonized the country and evoked so much fear that even the Forbes magazine labeled India as one of the most dangerous countries to visit if you're a woman traveling solo. I think somebody, I'm sorry to interrupt, somebody should turn the mic off. There's some problem with somebody there. Maybe Raisa can fix that, please. So as you argued in your essay Under Western Eyes, these are Western construct of an archetypical victim figure. And the terrible Delhi gun rape case will work as a mirror, for example, to what happened in Spain a few years later in 2016, when an 18-year-old girl was gun raped at the Pamplona Bull Running Festival. 2 years later of that case, when we had the trial for that, the 5 men who attacked her were found guilty for, and I quote, continuous sexual abuse of the young girl, but not of rape. So I could unfortunately add more cases of recent gun rapes in Spain, but what is amazing is that, for example, the same magazine, Forbes, placed Spain as #1 safest country to travel solo as a woman. So I think that's biased in a way. So my question could be if you could elaborate on the idea of Indian women giving a voice in Western media only if they fit into the sensationalist narrative, and on the politics of knowledge, obviously, and representation.
Yeah. So, you know, the idea of Indian women as victims, right, that need to be saved is, as you mentioned, it is a legacy of colonial times, right? So it's not, you know, and the counterpart of that is that the narrative of Indian men as predators and misogynists as well, okay? So Indian women as victims and Indian men as predators and misogynists, and so the savior, it's always the white Western savior that is lurking in the background of that, right? So obviously neither of these reflects reality in any way. Sexual violence is obviously a fact of life in most cultures around the world, as you said, in Spain with the gang rapes, everything else, right? So the global South does not have a monopoly on sexual violence. So we should be very clear about that, right? So I think the question is a question of representation and politics of knowledge and how they are tied in to a framework, which is a framework about an Orientalist framework that actually, sorry, my phone's ringing even though I've turned it off. it's really about a politics of representation. So the real question is, what interests do these particular Orientalized representations of Indian men and women serve in media constructions of the West and the rest, right? My sense is that these very narrow representations of Indian women that dominate hegemonic media discourses in the West, which is that we are either victims or we are exceptional, high-achieving individuals. Don't forget that we are that as well in scientific, political, and economic fields. So we have our Indira Gandhis and we have all the rest of us, right? So remember, it's possible to both be a victim and successful at the same time. Neoliberal discourses commodifies and orientalizes, colonizes us at the same time. All of this is possible at the same moment. So any of the complexities of being Indian women, that is, the complexities of caste, class, sexuality, and religion, are completely erased in this construction of the victimized woman. And as we know, there is actually no way to understand violence against women in India or elsewhere outside the context of social, religious, and economic violence that is endemic to life, which is a neoliberal capitalist country and also under Hindu fundamentalist rule at this time. So Islamophobia, Brahminical supremacy, sanctioned state violence, and caste class divides, as well as religious fundamentalist ideologies, are deeply intertwined in the forms of rape and violence against women that's enacted in India. I mean, no one can actually go and study all of the sort of cases of violence that have been, violence against women that have been sensationalized, and not understand how profoundly connected to questions of economics and caste, right? Especially how many Dalit women are raped, how state violence, which is the police and organized forms of the state, have participated in that, right? So we then need to talk about reconceptualizing sexual violence as connected to other forms of violence, right? So we need to link gender-based violence with the multiple forms of violence that make it possible. So the crisis of unemployment, precaritization, harsh conditions of exploitation, all of which are tied to patriarchal domination and misogyny, and not to mention what is seen as devalued masculinities in search of legitimation, right? So caste and religious fundamentalist gender ideologies play into all of that. So I think that is what I would say about what needs to happen. The reason it doesn't happen is because really what mainstream media, especially, and sometimes feminist NGOs that are much more Orientalist than they actually realize they are looking for are particular sound bites. You know, I mean, one of the reasons I am very reluctant to talk to mainstream media is because of this, because I feel like whatever I say will be assimilated into a hegemonic agenda, liberal agenda or feminist agenda, doesn't matter, both of those, right? And so what that means is, what will happen is it will be assimilated within a sort of racialized colonial narrative of white men saving brown women, although this time it's white women saving brown women, okay? So it involves really, what this move does is that it erases and commodifies the history of women's struggles for freedom in the global South. And it always sees us as victims, right? As isolated individuals, not as organized collective voices who have our own critiques and struggles and have been, I mean, the Indian women's movement is amazing, has been fighting against this, you know, like for over a century, I would say now, right? So with our own critiques and visions of justice. So why do mainstream audiences want to hear the story of victimhood? Because it reinforces the colonial narrative of the superiority of the West, including of Western feminism, and the necessity of white saviors, right? And remember, this narrative is used to justify war, empire, economic exploitation, refugees and migrant policies in the West. You know, all of these things are similar. And then in terms of the sound bites, right? So, you know, the only time when a sound bite works is if you reinforce the status quo, or what is seen as the commonsensical narrative, right? So if one has a narrative of, you know, India is the most dangerous country for women and Spain is the safest country for women, then unless your soundbite fits in to one or the other, right, you're not going to be understood. And that's part of the reason why, you know, the whole of the way this kind of media universe works, right, is one that needs challenging. And so if you disagree with this, to disagree with the status quo, it takes a while. It takes a little bit of time, you know, to lay out an argument that is going against the grain of something. And therefore, I think it becomes very, very difficult to, for me, it becomes very difficult. And if I'm asked to speak as an Indian woman, I will not speak. If I'm asked to speak as an anti-racist, feminist activist from the global South, then I will speak. So in other words, part of what my task is in these conversations is to think about difference and commonality, right, among and between cultures of rape and sexual violence in the way they emerge in different geopolitical spaces. And what then are the commonalities and differences among and between this? What kind of histories lead to these forms of violence? And what are the strategies that are being used by local feminist activists to combat, draw attention to critique, as well as to, you know, to do an analysis. I mean, part of the reason this kind of hegemonic Western feminist framework still works, you know, is because people are not listening to or paying attention to the knowledges that are being produced in local spaces in the global South. There's a lot of global South-South conversations, which are amazing to me, you know, but they're not really, they don't have the sort of play in the media in the West as they have, unless you go to alternative media, which, you know, to me is the only space we have to go. Because all of this is about what narratives are being told. What are the stories that are being told, right? And if we want to be ethical scholars who are in solidarity with women who are in different spaces in the world and who do not have the kind of power and the platform that we have in the West, right? Then I think we have to always look for alternative and multiple narratives of the same story, okay? And we have to be able to adjudicate between the multiple narratives in order to understand both what is going on and to be honest about, you know, how we come to the conclusions that we come to. Does that make sense?
Sure, absolutely. Yeah. And talking about solidarity, I remember very recently that I attended one of the webinars that you organized with the Democrats in Knowledge Collective. On the talk by Crispin Hernandez called my attention that he talked about the low-wage workers employed in their region, right, in central New York, that are abused, right, and not taken into consideration during the pandemics. So we in India, we find a similar case, a scenario, right? They just mentioned that in the introduction. So that the new laws will benefit like almost everywhere, big corporations, while small-scale farmers survive or struggle to survive, right? So it's very interesting how the Indian government, and I've been reading a lot about this, on February 23rd, the Indian government told the protesting women to go back home.
Yeah.
And the courts actually suggested that women were only care workers, providing just cooking, cleaning services at the camping sites. So that they were not like the rest of the stakeholders.
Yeah.
In Spain, we find the same case scenario. Again, it's transnational, no? In a way.
Right.
So most of the harvesting workers are exploited here. But more concretely, women who were brought from different parts of the world through a legal bilateral visa agreement to pick up fruits. I'm talking especially in the south of Spain, actually the town where I'm from, in Huelva. We can find that in Almeria also. These women are so much abused. I mean, they face what the human rights lawyers say that they could be even framed into state-sponsored human trafficking, which is amazing. So these women are sexually assaulted, raped, violently abused, forced to live in unsanitary housing, and threatened to be sent back home with no pay at all. But they're being stuck also in filthy housing, crowded places, and especially now with the pandemic, like it's not convenient at all, obviously, worse than ever. But these women are ignored. I mean, we don't get that in media, actually. Yes. And unless you're pretty much into that movement, there working with them, people just try to be, blind about it, like nothing happened here. So these women are ignored because of the gender, the race, and the economic status, class, right? So what are the theoretical foundations that you might provide about the fact that no formal investigation is launched by the courts or the police or whoever, right? Even when international NGOs with human rights lawyers are supporting these claims. We are facing this labor exploitation everywhere in the world, even in 21st century. And none of these countries, I'm just talking about this triangle, right? I connected Crispin talk with the farmers protest.
Exactly.
In India, and then in Spain, what is going on also, right? Just this triangle, but I'm sure that we could give a sample of other parts of the global south.
Right.
And well, not even in the global south, but also in the north.
Yeah.
But how could transnational solidarity give them access to justice, at least access to that, take into account that there are insufficient measures in place to ensure that the working and living conditions of farmers and harvesting workers, especially women, are the right one. And these women at least treated with dignity.
Right, right. I mean, I think that it's interesting because what you're describing, a lot of this is connected to migrant labor, right? I mean, if we are talking about, especially in Europe, women who are, brought for particular kind of agricultural labor, it's very similar to some decades ago when we were talking about women in factories, like the maquiladoras, in free trade zones around the world, right? And we were asking the same questions that, and actually the working conditions in many ways were very similar. These were young women who were brought, who were part of a labor system that subjected them to sexual violence, to all really horrendous living conditions, a whole bunch of different things, right? Now that we know that there was some real solid organizing, transnational organizing that happened, it hasn't solved the problem, right? Because we have, we might have things like the ILO, but we do not have the level of transnational organizing that in fact has also a feminist lens. Okay, so part of, I think, what is necessary is that we talk about workers in much more nuanced way, one, right? In terms of their gender, race, class, not class we do talk, but the nuanced ways. And the fact that, crossing borders, right, is something that is endemic and is in common. All of them have those things in common, right? Different kinds of borders. So I think that that form of transnational organizing, first of all, is something that starts locally, right? So when Crispin talked about it, that there is organizing happening in central New York. Now, when you talk about the situation in Spain, it is interesting to ask that question. Why is it that these workers are not seen as in any way connected to other workers' struggles in Spain, of which I am sure there are many, they're unionized workers' struggle. So that would be one question to ask. Why is it? And I think the answer is pretty straightforward, which is that what is being erased are the colonial racial legacies of where people come from and how they are, when they are they don't belong, and so they're non-citizens and they are there as workers or have a very different status. So there are all of these questions, I think, that we need to be able to ask in order to make the connections between these struggles, so that we don't just think that these are things happening in different parts of the world, but are unconnected. So they're clearly connected. And the way they're connected is the way particular governance, transnational capitalist and governance processes work, right? In order to bring workers, and particular gendered workers, in and situate them in conditions which are abject in the same ways across the world. So it should be possible for us to, in fact, create those forms of solidarities among us, And I think some of this is happening, but I really am a great believer in really paying attention to local struggles and in seeing how the local struggles always have a relationship to transnational processes, right? So while, it might be very hard unless there was some kind of organizing, grassroots organizing globally that happened that could link all this together, it is still possible to begin to organize locally and connect the situation locally to larger processes of governance and exploitation, which are right now, I think through COVID, so exposed. It's no longer possible to, even deny anywhere that women are frontline workers. That's actually a big shift if you think about that, because, we go from the sort of white feminist understanding of women need to work outside, right? Outside the home, which of course erases all women, poor women and women of color who've always worked outside the home, right? We go from that to here now, where women are, it is impossible, at least in the US, it is impossible to deny that it is women of color workers who are on the front lines. You just see them everywhere, right? What does that mean? That means you can no longer say, you can no longer have a unitary understanding or a simplistic understanding of the notion of women's work and who occupies those different positionalities. It can't be simplistic, because we're talking Black and brown people, we're talking, different genealogies in the US. Why does COVID hit Indigenous population in this huge way? Well, that then cannot be analyzed without thinking about settler colonial histories, and the erasure of Indigenous women from, in fact, the US landscape, visible landscape. So all of these things are becoming more visible. And that, to me, it feels like there's a moment of possibility if we are able to understand and organize around it. And I think people are. I think in the US, some of the most interesting organizing has been abolitionist feminist work, right? And one of the questions you had posed to me was around BLM and how that kind of influences some of the work we all do. And one of the things that the organizing since last summer across the world, right? So we had Black Lives Matter movements in all over the world. At one moment, I think it was in June or July, I saw some statistic that said something like there were marches in 40,000 cities around the world, and it included Tokyo and Hyderabad and Berlin, of course, and so that has, I think, what that has done is it has made visible the transnational sort of existence and significance of state violence in the control of populations. Okay, and that I think has been a huge sort of impact of that formation. So in India, there's always been sort of Dalit movements and Dalit feminist movements that have challenged, that have located the connection between sexual violence and state violence as completely connected, right? The same as in the US, that Black feminists have always made that connection between state violence and violence against women in whatever form, right? So I think that has been exposed in a way that is similar to when we had the Occupy movement. People started talking about the 98%, which was an anti-capitalist analysis, which in the US, people just, no, I mean, this is democracy, it's not capitalism, and capitalism is good for democracy. So I'm just saying that there are some moments and some things that have become visible that are really important for how we organize in the future and how we start making connections among and between struggles, and especially beginning from the location of some of the most marginalized communities of women and gender non-conforming people, right? I don't know if I answered your question, Antonia, I just went off.
Yes, absolutely. Yes, that was wonderful. Actually, we could talk about this forever, right?
Forever, I know.
Forever.
I know.
But we have limited time, so I'll skip to my outline.
So can I, you had a question about solidarity and alliance. Can I say a little bit about that?
Yes.
Because I don't want to stop without saying something about that, actually.
That was my next one, yeah.
Okay, so ask the question then.
Oh, that's fine, go ahead, please.
I had some notes to myself about solidarity, which I want. Okay, so a couple of things. I'm going to say a couple of things about decolonization, what it means to talk about a decolonial feminist framework and movement, right? And about solidarity, right? So, I mean, and I've said this and other people have said this before, so that decolonization is a process, right? It's a goal, right? It requires transformation of structures, right? And it requires also rethinking questions of self, community, and governance structures at all levels. It requires an active withdrawal of consent on our part, yeah? And a resistance to practices of psychic and social domination. It has to be a collective process. I never have thought that you can kind of decolonize yourself in a library somewhere. It doesn't happen that way. It has to be engaged within communities. Okay, so it needs to be a collective process, and it needs to be anchored in Indigenous and, Black, Indigenous, people of color histories of struggle. So it also requires recentering Indigenous worldviews and reimagining relationships with land, people, and the state, right? It requires study, it requires dialogue, and it requires unlearning colonial legacies. All of those things, right? All of which is a huge task, but is not something we can afford to not engage in, right? And then, you can think about this in relation to knowledge practices in the academy, and that's not something we need to go into, but it's something that's pretty straightforward, what it means to decolonize forms of knowledge and curriculum and scholarship, so that you actually are able to engage the multiple histories, and specifically the histories of colonization that are central to the way our institutions and their knowledge, the hegemonic knowledge practices run, right? Now, alliance and solidarity requires, I think, learning about, standing with, and being accountable to communities and movements that are fighting multiple forms of economic, political, and social, whatever, injustice and oppression, right? It's always an achievement, and it has to be built. It's not something you can take for granted. It involves following the indigenous people of taking leadership. In other words, if one has to build solidarity across differences in power, right, and privilege, it requires taking leadership, having humility, and honoring frontline voices of resistance. You can't be in solidarity, you can't be a good ally if you go in there and take charge, basically, right? And it also involves offering tangible solidarity as needed and requested by our allies, okay? Whatever that means. It involves building, it's different from support, okay? Support can be occasional support, right? Solidarity involves ongoing and sustained commitment, I think, right? It involves building long-term relationships of accountability and not taking personal or political trust for granted. You cannot take it for granted. It involves a community of shared interests, shared beliefs, and goals to unite around. We need to create that. That's what needs to be built. And then, frankly, it's really urgent and necessary, right? So those are some of the kind of general principles or things that I think are really important in thinking about alliances and solidarity, especially when we're thinking in terms of across class, race, sexuality, and national borders, right, in this situation. And there are examples of this, I mean, I'm thinking about the feminist strike in Latin America, and the way it traveled around the world, how it built certain kind of connections and solidarities. There are, examples that have to do with particular worker struggles that are happening. The stuff with the farmers movement and the kind of ways it has generated particular solidarities, the stuff that's happening around organizing in Kashmir against the Indian government, which has traveled around the world and has led to some pretty amazing kinds of interventions and forms of political education, actually, right? So I think that these are, they're examples of good ethical ways of building solidarity and alliance. And then the rest, which are commodified. I mean, there are also, people have also talked about solidarity as, buying goods from, empowering women in the third world by buying products that they make. that is not going to go very far and is not really about transforming anything. But it's also seen as solidarity, isn't it? And we sign 1,000 petitions. Yeah, which fine, it's good to sign a petition, but it's completely not sufficient in order to change any conditions, really. So I stopped there because it's also 1 o'clock.
Yeah. All right, Chandra, then just to finish, before questions, could you tell us a little bit more about your current project on these intergenerational conversations that you're working with the scholar activists from around the world?
Yes.
Your video archive, please.
Yes. So it's, so I'm really excited about it. Also because this is, it's a different format from writing, but I think it's both a form of scholarship and activism and political education, right? So this is an archive where, and I think it actually spatially represents the kind of thinking around transnational feminism that my colleague Linda and I have been engaged with for a long time. So we began by really understanding that there were people who all of us were reading, who feminist scholar activists, especially anti-capitalist scholar activists, whose work was very popular, but whose stories, their own personal political narratives, were not that easily accessible. And I believe, and we believe, that there is always a connection between our own genealogies, our multiple genealogies, and the kind of questions we ask, and the kind of issues we engage in, the kind of scholarship we produce, especially if it is social justice oriented scholarship and thinking, right? So that's where we just kind of started with what we saw as the sort of our own generation of scholars around the world who we knew and we could have 1-hour conversations with, and they're very amateurish, and our students did all the video work because we didn't have funding for it, we still don't. But what it has now is, it has about 40 conversations with feminist, we call them kitchen table conversations, with feminist scholar activists. Actually, if you can allow me to share the screen, I would like to bring it up.
Yes, sure. It could be nice.
Okay, so how do I do this?
Share a screen at the bottom.
Right, all it says is host disabled participant screen sharing.
Raisa, could you help with us?
I thought, it's always nicer to see something.
Yes, Raisa, are you there? Or if you give me the link through the chat.
I will. Can you bring it up?
It's
feministfreedomwarriors.org, all one word.
Feminist
Freedom
warrior.
Warriors with an S.org.
Yes. This one?
Yeah, that's it. And if you just kind of scroll down so people can just kind of, oh, it's not coming up.
These are the...
Oh, it hasn't come up yet, all the photos of all the people.
Just need some time. We have a few of them here.
Yeah,
Mina Kandasamy is there.
yeah, Mina's there. And we have actually a couple of fabulous ones from India, in fact.
Yes, checking some time for.
Okay, so she says I can share it now.
Oh, okay, good. So I'll just
That,
stop
yeah,
sharing.
let me
this.
just.
Okay, stop
Oh,
sharing.
now you got it though. That's funny.
Well,
Okay, let me do it. Okay, mine is taking a while to load now. There we go. It still doesn't, it's the same thing. It's the same problem. So don't worry about it. It's too much, because all it says is host disabled, whatever.
no.
Yeah, you go ahead, yeah. So you see, we have, yeah, keep going down a little bit. Now you have all the, so we had Nandita Shah, and I don't know if you know Nandita Shah's work, and Flavia Agnes, both of which we did in India when we were in India together for the first time, actually. So anyway, it's with the book Feminist Freedom Warriors is some of the early interviews, but it's more than that. And it's just a way of kind of looking at how people's, these feminist genealogies have both points of connection and have their own specific sort of place-based struggles and organizing around feminist questions. So, and I'm hoping we have, you know, been hoping that this can be used for organizing, grassroots organizing, and in the classroom. And it has been, you know, so it's, and as you see, it's a complete variety of
Did you stop the project during the pandemic because of impossibility of traveling?
Yeah, we haven't been able to do. We did some last, I think it was February or so. But after that, we haven't been able to. I think what we're going to try is do some Zoom ones now.
Yes.
I'm reluctant to do it because I can't even imagine, because there's something so immediate about being able to sit around a sofa, and many of them are done in our homes or, you know, offices or whatever. So it's literally, you know, very
amazing. Yeah, exciting.
It is exciting.
Yeah,
and we'll continue it. So
yeah, all the best for that.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for being such an inspiration in bringing about change in the world.
Thank you. And thank you for asking these questions that made me think.
Hello again.
Okay, there we go.
Thank you very much, Chandra and Antonia, for this wonderful conversation. And we all have been taking notes, and I want also to congratulate you for this project. I think it's just wonderful for it, you know, all of us to have the chance to see the conversations. And I really, you know, I think this idea that you were mentioning, that there is always a connection between our personal genealogies and the works, you know, that we produce and what we do and why we are doing this. And I think it is very, very important to have that kind of documentary narrative as well, and not just, you know, the academic essays that we all read and share, but sometimes in those conversations is where, like today in this conversation as well, you know, that where thinking is produced and
Yes.
realized, right? And I
Yes,
think the kitchen
absolutely.
table is a perfect space for that.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, also because I think that I don't know about others, but I deeply believe that a lot of the ways I think emerge through dialogue, you know, and that these dialogues usually are with people who are unlike me. Okay, so some of the most interesting insights, I think, come from, you know, being in a space with people who are, you know, cross many different borders in relation to your own identity, right? And that discussion, I think, can lead to some really amazing insights. And it's kind of the opposite of, you know, what's the word I want? It's the opposite of kind of narrow thinking, you know, where you just, you talk about what you know. Well, what you know is completely dependent on who you're talking with and what communities you are a part of. So that actually also, that dialogue really is a way of modeling some of that, right? That's why this was so much fun for me, Antonia, you know.
I would like the audience to place your questions on the chat box, please. You have some time for questions and comments. Anyone? I'm sure there would be some. No? I'm taking then. Okay, someone. Maria Raymond says, thank you so much for this talk. As a feminist and post-colonial translator, I'm always concerned about dialogue and diversity being discussed only in English.
Yeah.
How do you see the role of language diversity in feminist solidarity?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a very important question. And this is one of the difficulties with those of us who grow up with only one language, really, and who also operate in English as a very hegemonic language. So I feel like what we need are, you know, various forms of cross-translation. I mean, I have had dialogues with people, feminists in Latin America, with, you know, people in different parts of the world. And one of the reasons I sort of have always appreciated people translating anything I write is because it honestly reaches very different audiences. So it's not, you know, so some of these conversations, I mean, unfortunately, I can only respond in English, but I have relationships with people who are translators, and therefore I do have conversations that are with people in other languages once work has been translated. But yeah, I mean, I think we need different feminist hubs almost in different languages, yeah, that where the work that's being produced it's not always English is translated into something else, but the other way around as well, that we need translations from, you know, Arabic, Spanish. We have Spanish more than anything else, but, you know, Italian, a whole bunch of other languages. So, yeah.
I think we need funds for that.
We need funds for that for sure.
Yeah.
This is the problem, right?
The democratizing knowledge collective that you created with your colleague, that's an amazing job with that. Like
Yeah.
in the webinars, you have list Spanish and English and sign language
Yes.
as well.
Yes. Yeah. Actually, Antonia, we're having the next one. You'll hear about it when it's decided, but this is on the impact on indigenous populations.
Nice.
Yeah. So it's it'll be soon, next month, I think.
We have another question from Ana Maria Crespo Gomez. Thank you for this amazing talk. I would like to know your insights on how to learn decolonization as an Indian in terms of gender when living in a West country without adopting an Orientalist point of view.
Hmm. Okay, I'm trying to understand the question. Is the question, Ana Maria, you asking the question that how to engage in decolonization in relation to India when one is living in the West? Is that the question that's being asked? Yes, okay. So I think that so for me, right, and this is another piece that I ended up writing about, but Antonia didn't ask me the right question for this one. But for me, right, that form of decolonization has been around Brahminical patriarchy and Dalit feminism. Okay, so what's interesting is, of course, there's a whole history of Dalit feminist work, which is decolonizing work within Indian feminism, right? So, but when I was growing up in India and before I left India, it's only the last 10 years that there has been a visibility of this kind of work, right? So it's only since I've been in the US that I've had access to some of this work. So I think that one of my challenges has been, as somebody who's not a Brahmin, but is completely a participant in Brahminical patriarchy, right, in India, how I can take on the challenges that are posed by Dalit feminists, right, to those of us who are non-Dalit, right, and what that would mean in terms of my own, what forms of solidarity and alliances I could build with Dalit feminists, right? And interestingly enough, it is by living in the US and being connected with women of color in the US, right, that I have learned to understand how to do some of this work. Okay, so in other words, a lot depends on even those of us who are diasporic people, right, and are displaced in the West and are away from India or Bangladesh, wherever, and we're in the West in some ways. A lot depends on the communities we form, on the connections we end up seeking. And for me, my entire history has been around women of color, epistemology in the US and struggles. So that allows me a way to reflect on my own erasures in relation to Dalit feminism. So I don't know if I answered the question, but that's an example of what I would have to do living in the West. So forget Orientalized. I mean, that I have enough of a grounding in not doing that, but this is a challenge for me in terms of my own privilege.
So build alliances without patronalizing, right?
Yes, exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
There is another question from Nadine. Well, we are getting more and more questions, but Nadine Chantal Murshid, such a great talk. I love your idea of solidarity, but when we go to the global south, feminist work is done by middle-class women who are in many ways akin to white feminists. How do we break that class barrier that keeps marginalized women marginalized from this discourse, other than through the lens of middle-class women who write in English?
Yeah, I think the answer to that is, just going back to some of the things I said about solidarity and alliances, I think if this is what you care about or we care about, then we have to position ourselves as a learner in relation to poor and working class and peasant women's struggles, right? And we have to work, for instance, instead of writing something as a middle class educated woman about the struggle of women farmers somewhere, yeah, make an attempt to write with somebody in that situation so that points of view being represented are not just your own. So that's a simple answer to that question. But this, what you're asking, is a much larger question, which is, you know, the knowledges that are being produced by middle class educated women. I don't think there's anything wrong with that, but I think what is problematic is when middle class educated women speak for everyone else. And what we have to do is to figure out a way to speak with and not for people.
We have another question from Felicity Hand. With regard to NGOs, more than white women trying to save brown women, isn't it more a case of the middle classes trying to clear their guilty consciences about exploited working class women?
Sorry.
With regard to NGOs.
I see it. I'm trying to read it. Okay. Trying to say middle classes trying to. Yeah, but I mean, with some, yes, it is clearly that. With some, I mean, there's all this work now on the NGOization of the women's movement that illustrates all of this stuff, you know? So yeah, I mean, especially regional and national NGOs, yeah, that is very often the case. But, you know, I am not, I wouldn't, you know, throw out the work that middle class women do completely, because I think there is a role that we have to play in some of this. And instead of, I mean, I always have trouble thinking about doing any kind of work around justice that comes from guilt. I mean, it to me is a completely it's an emotion that recenters yourself. I guess that's what I would say. Guilt, it's an emotion that recenters yourself, and that's a problem. So instead of guilt, if we can be aware of the privileges that we have, right? And we can utilize those privileges, right, to make some kind of intervention. That is a much better way to create connections across various borders and lines. You know, guilt, I think, is very, very useless. I would rather be angry. You know, angry on behalf of what the shit is going on around us, not just us.
We have a long one. Can you just read it?
I will.
Hi, I would like to address a question to Professor Mohanty. I'm a master's student at Autonomous University of Barcelona, and I'm currently working on an autobiographical fiction by Fatima Mernissi called Dreams of
Trespass. Yeah, I know that.
And one of the many issues that I came across writing for a Western jury, although very familiar as post-colonial researchers of the theory involved and Orientalism in general. However, working with a text that belongs to a world that is usually dismissed in the English literary studies, North African literary studies usually considered Francophone. Also had to struggle with decolonizing many notions related to the cultural and ethnic misconception of, let's say, Morocco as being Arab, which in fact is not, as the vast majority consider themselves Amazigh, native indigenous North Africans. Part of my research is to bring to light the place of native Amazigh women in the autobiographical fiction and decolonize them from first
Arabization. Yeah.
Arabization. How do you decolonize what is almost impossible to decolonize?
Well, that seems to be what you're doing. It seems to be where you're headed. You know, I mean, I'm actually familiar with both the Mernisi book, which I, teach in my graduate seminar every year. I teach this book, which I love. And when you're talking about the, decolonizing and taking sort of challenging the Arabization, right? It seems to me that it's yet another layer that requires some really important, careful work, and it hasn't really been done so far. I mean, I don't know if people like Zakia Salme or Fatima Siddiqui or any of them are doing work that is useful in this, right? And I don't know if you're asking me, yeah. And so the first part of your question though was something around how it is not, okay, because the text doesn't belong to Anglophone post-colonial spaces, that it is not, it's usually dismissed, usually considered, yeah. So then that then is what you're drawing attention to, is actually the question of how work gets categorized, right? And how sometimes these categories are constructed in very exclusionary ways, which is in fact the opposite of trans or interdisciplinary kinds of work, which is why I think some of the more valuable work that we are able to do really is interdisciplinary work, you know. So I think that's it. I don't know what else I would add to that, but oh, well, you know what I would add to that? Here, I find it difficult.
I find it difficult as a male homosexual Muslim North African to speak about Amazigh women, and that I have almost no authority in talking about so.
Yeah, so I think the question then becomes, in what way could you locate yourself in relation to this community of women, right? And I don't know that you need to have authority in speaking about Amazigh women. I think that what you need is a way of approaching the sort of research you're doing, in which you're able to create connections with this community in order to find your own voice and space in doing this research, right? So it's not easy, but I would also not assume that there are no, men who are queer in this community. In other words, you need not necessarily be the kind of complete outsider as you may see yourself as right now.
Thank you.
Yeah.
More questions or comments? I agree.
Yeah.
It's an honor.
Authenticity is weaponized to silence people. Absolutely. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And the thing is, this, it is, I mean, actually, there's nothing else to say, Nadine. That's exactly right.
More comments or questions?
Thank you all, though. This has really been...
May I ask you something?
Of course, Belen.
I was just waiting to see if there was some silence there. You were talking before when talking about labor and migrants and how women are exploited. Antonia was mentioning the women in Spain and in other contexts, right? And you mentioned at that point how colonial legacies are erased, right? That we are not bringing the sort, what is at the root of all this exploitation. Yes. And I would like you to expand a little bit more on that if you may have time, because it's something we discuss, or at least I discuss with the students a lot, and I think it's absolutely crucial that we understand how in the 21st century we do have colonialism yet.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
It hasn't disappeared, and especially when you deal with post-colonial studies, people get the idea, right? Many
that
people,
we're no post.
Yeah, there is no post. So I would like you to, if you can comment a bit more on how colonialism is at the source of all these, labor movements and
exactly.
And
yeah,
I
so
always talk of indentured labor.
Right.
As
yeah. So yes, because colonialism is not a singular formation. In order to understand it, you also have to understand racial capitalism and the way it develops in relation to colonialism, right? So in order to understand the situation of migrant workers all over the world, right, you have to go back to colonial legacies and legacies of racial capitalism, how labor was used and how labor, how communities of indentured labor, slavery, all of the different things that we know now as categories of labor were mobilized in colonial times, wherever we begin, are actually reinvented in the present. And therefore, not just the ideologies of, not just racialized, gendered ideologies persist, right? But the colonial actually traffics in the present because it makes, it situates particular communities of workers in very specific places that cannot be understood without looking at the history, right? One of your other questions, Antonia, was this thing about, history as well. I feel like without these histories, we can't understand anything, but also without the right histories, which are the histories of colonialism, exploitation, oppression, dominance, all of these things, capitalism, without those structural histories, it is very difficult to think about how to organize struggles for freedom of any kind. Yeah. So, I mean, that's what I would say, Belen. I don't know if I answered it, but it's just, there's no two ways about it. And the reason, most nation states want to pay no attention to this, right, is because paying attention to this means you have to even consider things like reparations, perhaps. Yeah. And nobody wants to do any reparations, right? So I think that it's quite straightforward if you have the lens, if you have the framework, if you have the way to analyze these questions.
I would say it's not only reparations, but even stopping the exploitation of the resources, human and material. Right?
Absolutely. Yep.
Okay. Any other questions? Last call for questions. No. Well, it has been really a wonderful, wonderful evening. A perfect International Women's Day.
I know. I'm happy to celebrate with you all.
It's been really great. Thank you, Antonia, also for organizing all this and for your questions. Would you like to say something before we close, Antonia?
I'll just appreciate everyone's being here and celebrate with us, and especially Chandra from, I know that you have a busy day ahead over there. So thank you for your time, for the wonderful, wonderful insights about the different topics we have exposed here.
Thank you. Thanks, Antonio. And Antonia, please send me a recording if you have it.
Yes, I will. As soon as Raisa has it ready, I will.
Yes. Yeah.
And it will be uploaded on the website of the association. So anyone who has attended, or if you want also to share the link later, you can also share it once it is uploaded there. Thank you very much, everyone.
Be well and have a good evening, people. Stay safe, everyone.
Have a good day.
Thanks.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you so much.
Bye.